welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and this week I'm really happy to welcome onto the program Cathy Coleman. Cathy, thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's really a pleasure to have you on here. And we want to talk about who you are, what your work is, a new book that came out. And so just a little bit of a bio. You're a former dean of students at the California Institute of Integral Studies, which people who've watched the podcast know that that's where I got my PhD. And so it holds a very special place in my heart. President of Kepler College, director of ION's Earthrise Retreat Center. And like me, you also live in Sonoma, California. And you were the wife of Ralph Metzner for 31 years. And again, people who watch the podcast know that Ralph also holds a very special place in my heart. And recently released a edited volume called Ralph Metzner, Explorer of Consciousness: The Life and Legacy of a Psychedelic Pioneer. So really happy to chat with you about all this. Because again, people who know the podcast know that these are things that very much intersect with some of the most important parts of my life, my work. Um, so to begin with, before we start talking about all the work you do, I always like to hear a little kind of autobiography of because it's most of the people on this podcast have uh, a life path that is contrary to the dominant paradigm in our society. And these kind of intersections where you care about things like transpersonal psychology or psychedelic studies or the intersection of ecology and spirituality, these are often things that are kind of on the margins for most people. A lot of people are just doing STEM work. They're like, it's science, technology, engineering, mathematics, that's it. Getting a job to make money and that kind of stuff. So I'm curious to hear a little bit of your personal journey into this.
Well, that question takes me back to, yeah, I grew up in a small town in Missouri, and I guess I was a little different than most people because, for one thing, I wanted to go outside of Missouri to go to college. I just knew that the world was a much bigger place. But also just talking about kind of being different. I mean, I grew up in a Methodist church, but my mother had a very metaphysical view of the world, so
Hmm.
it was much bigger than the Methodist Church. Uh, and once when I was in high school, they had a course on world religions, and so as a kid, I signed up for it. So I was like, and then I had a brother who was very expansive, a younger brother actually, who really kind of, you know, widened my worldview on about everything. And um, so while I had this somewhat traditional upbringing, there were pieces that were emerging, that were different. Like searching began early, I guess you could say.
Hmm.
Um, and I went to Iowa State school, and I to get my bachelor's degree, and then I ended up going to Peace Corps with my
Hmm.
first husband, and um, that was a pretty big, broad, eye-opening experience. We were in Ecuador, and um, uh, in a way, that was just a big pivotal thing that changed my life and um, uh, my worldview.
Hmm.
Kind of. I mean, it's just so expansive. It's so expansive. It opened so many doors. And then after that, I left my first husband, and then I went to Washington State University for graduate school,
Hmm.
and I really liked graduate school. And so then I began to search for, well, actually, I was applying to schools that were kind of traditional. I didn't know anything about CIIS, but I had this query in my mind. I go, somewhere you should be able to study. Like I was really interested in psychology, but I knew there was more to psychology than just, you know, personality theories. I mean,
Right.
there's like the bigger, broader worldview and reincarnation and past lives and all this that enters into it that traditional psychology programs don't even touch. And so I just thought, where is there a place, is there any place in the world you can go to study these subjects, study a more integrated worldview along with psychology. And so I actually wrote to about, I had a magazine, a Theosophy magazine, and it had a lot of um, articles in it, things I was interested in, and so I wrote to a bunch of authors in that magazine and asked if there was any place in the world that you could study psychology with this from a spiritual perspective. And so that's how I found CIS. You know, one of them wrote me back immediately and said, the place for you is California Institute of Integral Studies. So the rest is kind of history. I came there, and of course that's where I met Ralph and my worldview. I was also really, my brother sort of opened up the idea of this astrological worldview to me, my
Mm,
younger brother. So I had that interest even before I got out of high school. And then when I moved to Houston, Texas for 1 year, just before I went to Peace Corps, that was my first like full on taking an astrology class from someone. And from there on, it's been a lifelong hobby, and that lifelong hobby developed into a profession. And so I've been a professional astrologer for many decades now. But I carry the same kind of thing with me. I'm really interested in different systems of thought, so I'm I'm well versed in both Western and Vedic astrology, and
mm.
I've also been studying some Hellenistic astrology. So it's like I have all these different worldviews, so which is sort of like a CIS student would have. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
So anyway, that's my brief biography. I mean, and then kind of for work all along. I mean, I went to work as at CIS about a year after I was a doctoral student there. And I mean, like my second year in my doctoral studies. And
Mm,
I did I basically ran the administrative side of the school,
mm.
basically, because it was very small. It was like 171 students when I first came there.
Wow.
And so that was one sort of uh, well, in my piece in the book, I talk about, how I knew Ralph in these various iterations, but the second one was we were colleagues really, and he was the academic dean, and then I was the director of student services. So basically, we collaborated all the time on all kinds of matters. Like actually, we were instrumental in bringing in the somatic creative arts therapy and drama therapy program when Antioch College closed
Oh,
and they wanted to come over to CIS.
right.
So we were saying yes, but there were a lot of administrative details to figure out, like how to bring those programs to CIS. So, you know, sometimes I had more of he had the academic, I had the administrative, but we took put them together, and so we made all kinds of things happen. Yeah.
That's great. And I have so much respect for people who do that kind of administrative work because I don't have a head for that at all. But it's what makes these institutions as great as they can be. And knowing how much CIS just exploded, and this tiny, tiny little school, and then folks like you and with Ralph, other folks like Robert McDermott, and people just kept building and building and building, and now it's this big, thriving institution. Obviously, still relatively small compared to the big research universities out there. But yeah, I have so much respect for that. I'm curious, I wasn't into astrology at all until I went to CIS and I was like, wow, and was just amazed by it. But one of the questions that I always have is how do you deal with the differences between the different systems? Like the difference between, Vedic astrology, for instance, and because that's just always an ongoing question for me. Like, how do you like choose one as your favorite, or do you somehow overlay all of them? Like, how do you do if you're like reading my like natal chart, which system are you using?
Well, my view is that they all work. And for example, I mean, Vedic astrology and Western, they're they're based on two completely different systems. Vedic is based on the constellations and where planets are in the sky. But because of the precession of the equinoxes, Western astrology is based on the seasons. And like
Right.
right now, there's 24-degree difference between those two systems.
Oh,
So
wow.
they both work, but they're built on different principles. And so they're like different perspectives. And so like I always just say, I kind of see double.
Hmm.
I like I don't even think of somebody as if I, if I know their horoscopes, I just like think of them as okay, they're this way from this perspective, and they're another way from another perspective. But it's interesting because I have an ongoing study with a Vedic teacher, and everybody there pretty much, I mean, there's a few people who switched over from Western, like, but they're pretty much, true Vedic astrologers. And I'm the one who, okay, well, yeah, there's this way, and then there's this view, and then there's this one. And my teacher really likes that. She always has me speak
Hmm.
at her conferences, and she always wants me to kind of bring in the Western because I think, she appreciates that I'm a good Vedic student, but I still hold my Western. I'm not a convert. I'm a plus, an
Right.
plus. And then there's the Hellenistic, which they're just built on different principles. Like they use the whole house system instead of more divisions. And there's a lot of younger astrologers these days who think whole house system is the way to go. And
Hmm.
most older astrologers think, no, it's not the way to, it's not the way to go. It
Hmm.
should be unequal. And but it just puts things in different ways. And I think, okay, in one system you might have your sun might be in the third house, and another it might be in the fourth or something. But
Right.
okay, they both probably apply. And
Hmm.
yeah, there's just yeah, different resonances.
I like that a lot. Yeah, seeing double, and like that's a great metaphor for it. It's because it's something I wrestle with personally is, thinking just in terms of like the world's religions. I'm like, well, I think everybody's right, but based on such different principles. And so holding that tension, I'm like, okay, well, from this perspective, this is what's showing up. From this perspective, here's who you are. And if you can kind of hold that tension and not just say one is the correct one and everybody else is wrong, I think that's such a great way to think. And of course, this is what, integral studies is about. Like, how do you integrate multiple perspectives and without just assimilating them all into one thing, but like honoring the differences? I appreciate that a lot. And it's
Yeah.
complicated and difficult work. So I can imagine why somebody's
Right.
like, hey, I like this. Like your Vedic teacher being like, this is good because
Right.
it highlights the contrast. And that shows why a Vedic perspective is so important, but it also shows why other perspectives are important as well. Um, yeah, no, that's great and really inspiring. It's funny, even having a PhD and being a professor for a number of years, I'm still like, oh, I have so much to
Right. I
learn.
know. Well, I think that's it. I think when you're a scholar, you of whatever subject or multiple subjects, there's always way more to learn about everything.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's kind of why we get into this. It's like I just want to
Right,
keep learning. Yeah. I like
right,
what you're saying. You're
right,
like, I like graduate school. Like
right,
there's something really fun about like I just get to keep learning. This is fantastic.
right.
Well, we definitely have to talk more about Ralph Metzner. And again, there's this wonderful book, Ralph Metzner, Explorer of Consciousness, that just came out recently. And so I wonder if you could talk about Ralph a little bit first, and then we'll talk about the book a little bit. But of course, his work was so influential. It's basically the reason I came to CIS was because of Ralph, and it was like his last year of teaching, so I barely made it.
Mm,
And
mm,
I was so happy to be able to take a few classes from him and to get to talk with him. But of course, his life and his legacy. His legacy certainly lives on in that school and in so many different people, his students, his colleagues, his clients. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about what his work is, and then we'll talk about what's going on in this amazing text that you've edited.
um, well, I think exploring consciousness, and that would that kind of sums up, everything because he had so many different interests and so many different paths he followed really. And then I once when he retired from CIS, I was trying to think, well, what if I had to say one word that, described him, what what would it be? And I thought it's alchemy because he was
Mm.
quite the alchemist of always just pulling things from everywhere. I mean, besides he taught alchemy and he actually taught an alchemy class at CIS like
Really?
in the early days. I took it in the
Oh,
very early
cool.
days, and but he wrote about alchemy and etc. And then actually his very last book, he had this book he was working on alchemy just before he died. I mean, it had all these alchemical terms, and a few days before he died, he pulled his editor and me in, and he said, if I don't finish this before I die, he said, I want you to finish it. So that was the first thing I did when he died. I just finished that book, and um, so it's a little book, but anyway, it's a worthy book. And um, we had the opening at Harvard. Um, I mean, I might even go back to, he was a scholar at Oxford.
Mhm.
And then I've had the great privilege of reading his letters to his parents because they kept them all over the years. And
Oh,
so I've
wow.
been reading them. So there's some interesting insights in those letters. But one around that period, he was talking about he really wanted to go to the United States and study psychology and just see if he would be if psychology would fit him. Where his father was a book publisher of kind of, well, his father had a private business publishing the birth, death, and marriage records of Germany. And the family business they still do that
Oh,
to
wow.
this day. Yeah. So, but anyway, his father wanted him to come back and, be in the family business.
Right.
I mean, Ralph's the middle of three brothers. He wanted all of them to. None of them did. But, but anyway, Ralph wanted to try it out as a psychologist and just see. So I think he had five different offers from different schools in the US, and one was Harvard. And so he wanted to go to Harvard. So he just went off in this spirit of kind of experimenting, like, okay, I'm just going to go there for at least a year and see how it goes. Well, then that's when Leary and Alpert they were his professors. And so then they started their psychedelic studies, and, the rest is history. But I think, it all, like the pieces all fit together because Ralph was so open. He was so curious. And in fact, his brother notes in the chapter or the little essay that he wrote in the book, his brother noted that one time he visited him, his younger brother, and like Ralph was reading the Bible and at the same time taking him out to nightclubs in France and showing him the world. And what that like said to me was, oh my gosh, it's like he was always just so curious. He wanted to know. And that was one of his great talents was he knew so much about Eastern and Western thought,
Mhm.
and that that everything he did, he brought that vast knowledge you know, into that subject or that teaching or that inquiry. And that's what made him so incredibly interesting. And I think too that he also, didn't have a very, he didn't have a fixed view of things. He had a very open-minded view of things. And as a student, I was always, after a while, I mean, I had 7 classes from him. I got, I thought, oh, it's interesting. Every class, he always asked his assignments, he always asked you to compare and contrast
Hmm.
different things. So it was an interesting exercise of what's the same, what's different. And, um, but anyway, so there was the psychedelic opening, which just carried through his entire life. And then he had about a 10-year involvement with the School of Actualism, which is a light work. It's like also called Agni Yoga, and it's like working with imagery, light fire imagery, and And so that also continued as a thread throughout his life when he worked with people, individuals, psychedelic journeys, I think in his classes even, uh, you know, at home, the practices in the family life. I mean, it was always like he he had this foundation of this light work as transformational. And then, there's the ecology piece. So he just was kind of on the forefront of that. I mean, he was always interested. Like, Hildegard, we had a Hildegard von Bingen songs at our wedding,
Mm,
and we were married by a Native American elder, and
mm,
it was very earth-based, elemental based. I mean, uh, we went on a vision quest, before we were married, and then he went on a vision quest to get a vision for our marriage. And I
mm.
mean, he was always interested in all these things. And so that was just, I guess it was kind of natural that he got more and more interested in sort of almost creating this field of green psychology or eco psychology. Like,
Right.
um, he gravitated toward, Ted Rozak, who was early pioneer of that work too. And um, so then he had that thread going, and then he was also very, I mean, he also had all these esoteric interests. I mean, like one class I took from him at CIS was um, in uh, esoteric systems of thought.
Mm,
So it was based on his book Maps of Consciousness. So it was astrology, I Ching, tarot, um, uh, Agni Yoga, alchemy, and um, he too was a practicing astrologer at one time. I mean, when we got married, he kind of said, "Okay, I'm just going to be the psychologist, you be the astrologer," and so anyway, that we kind of had that split, but he would always he'd refer his clients, and he'd also ask me to do charts, for his clients
mm.
that with their permission. But anyway, um, uh, so where was I going with that? Oh, just the fact that I mean he could do all those esoteric, those wild, non-ordinary esoteric things, and he was good at it. He had a deep knowledge. I mean, he was really brilliant. He just had so much knowledge about so many things. Like,
Yeah.
that it really just there was always a new thread he was kind of following. And I used to, on his desk, he used to have diagrams on his desk. He'd be thinking of a new theory or something and sort of mapping it out and I think, oh, that's so interesting that he's got this idea, but then he's kind of working it, like at his
Right.
desk.
Yeah. Instead of being like, well, I have enough theories already. Why need to take on another thing? No, hold on, this one's good too. Uh, yeah, and I can't say enough good things about Maps of Consciousness. That is a fantastic book and such a great way to see so many different esoteric sciences and lined up with one another without being opposed to one another. Um, and I wonder, along those lines, I mean, so many different threads. Like you said, he's just, such a capacious thinker. And I'm not sure how many people that listen to this podcast know enough about alchemy. It's certainly an inspiring school of thought for me personally, and it's a great example of the intersection of religion and ecology, because it's very elemental but also very spiritual. So I wonder if you could say a little, what's alchemy for somebody who hasn't heard of it, or for the people who have heard of it but have just heard it was people who weren't doing chemistry correctly, right? That's kind of the modern understanding, is that alchemy is somehow obsolete, that it was this, incorrect understanding of what the elements were, which is such a terrible misreading. I'd love to hear a little about it because, again, that's one of the pieces of his work that really helped me personally, and of course, other scholars who've worked on alchemy. But he was kind of my intro into it. So I wonder if you could say a little, what is alchemy? Why does it still matter today?
I can take a shot, and then I would love to hear yours as well. Um, but I think of it as it's kind of this it's kind of this way of holding all of life, like the evolution of life through, you know, dissolution, through, coming together, like amalgamation, separation. I mean, just all these things. And in some ways, when you're cooking you're cooking something, it's sort of like you can think of it as, I mean, and I guess that's a good metaphor for how how people do life in general. But like you can just kind of cook mindlessly and throw things together and throw something on the table. You
Right.
can think about it. Then you can also think about it. Like you think about how do things combine? How do you get the right heat? For the right heat, the right temperature, the right this, that, so that you take all these ingredients and you create something.
Yeah.
And in a way, that's like also what alchemy is too. It's just always a process of life. And sometimes life needs to, things need to come together and, create gold, maybe in a way. Sometimes they need to dissolve and separate and so something new can be created. Um, but I guess in a way I'd say and it's a constant evolution. I mean, and even a couple, I think of like these images of a couple coming together, and then there's sort of the union.
Mhm.
And really, when you think about the life of two individuals coming together, it's a constant um, alchemical uh, experiment, I guess you could say. Because there's like you're trying to build something, but also you have these separate entities and that are different, and trying to understand each other and trying to figure out how to blend those elements. And um, so I guess that's those are some of my thoughts. I'd be interested in yours.
No, that's pretty good. And I especially appreciate that you said that without having to get into the details of thinkers like Paracelsus and stuff like that. It's like you could get very academic and it kind of misses the point because it's about our lived experience. And and especially, I mean, yeah, it's like the idea of trying to take lead and make gold out of it. And then people are like, that's impossible. That's not a thing. And you're like, it's a metaphor. And
Right,
so,
right, right. Yes, I
and
didn't use the word metaphor. It is a metaphor.
yeah,
Yes,
and I remember,
yes.
one of the things I appreciate is taking classes with Ralph. He had us read George Lakoff's book, Metaphors We Live By. And it's like, it's metaphor. Metaphor is how the mind processes things. It's metaphors, it's symbols. I mean, it's the same with like the virgin birth in Christianity. People are like, that's not a thing. Like, it's a metaphor. And so some people get so confused by spiritual systems just because they're using metaphors. But it's like, yeah, I mean, lead is that we're all messy people, but gold is you can turn this mess into something really beautiful. And the example of a romantic relationship is such a good example. 'Cause it's like, well, we're two people, but we're becoming one, especially in marriage. There's some kind of union, and yet we're still different. And so, how do you deal with that? And there's this, this dissolving of two into one, and yet there's also the separation where we're still two. I always think, especially, that loving a person is so different than loving food. Because if I love a piece of cake, I'm going to eat that cake and dissolve the cake inside of me, and the cake has been destroyed. But when you love a person, it's a love that still lets the other person be themselves. And so, how do you love in a way where you're trying to become one, but you're also still becoming two? You're different, but you're unified. And that kind of, I think that's a beautiful example of what alchemy is all about. And still to this day, I mean, so many of the metaphors are still things I'm trying to explore, like the meaning of sulfur and salt and things like that, and earth and fire and water. So yeah, I think it's a beautiful symbol system and one that's so relevant to a time of ecological crisis where we need a spirituality that thinks in terms of the elemental. And instead of this otherworldly spirituality that's just about getting to heaven when you die and stuff like that. And so yeah, means a lot to me. And And I'd be curious to talk to chemists. I bet there's a lot of chemists out there who are secretly into alchemy and still don't talk about it.
Mhm.
Because like, well, academically, this isn't allowed. But I'm like, I would love to hear what they have to say. Um, so yeah, that's a shout out to alchemy. And again, Maps of Consciousness, such a good book for illustrating these things. Like, okay, here's alchemy, here's tarot, here's the I Ching, and there's so many great systems to use that are kind of underneath the world's religions. And that's,
Mhm.
esoteric, right? And again, just like with astrology, there's different systems of alchemy. If you look across the world, different people have had these symbols for talking about the elements. And yeah, I think it's such important work. Um, and of course, you also mentioned Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. I think most people on this podcast might know Richard Alpert as Ram Dass, of course. And that's so interesting to me that Ralph came to Harvard to study with those guys. He's just like, I'm just going to do psychology in America. Let's see what happens. Then he ended up with some of the craziest psychologists you could possibly imagine. He could have gone to like Stanford or any number of places and then wouldn't have found that path. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, like, because I was interested in psychedelics before really getting involved in like graduate studies. And so the idea that you're interested in this stuff and then you go to this graduate program where there's these professors who are like, "Hey, have you heard of LSD and psilocybin and things like that?" What was that like? That seems like I don't know what I would think at the time. I might think maybe I am in the wrong program because this seems pretty far out. I'm really curious what his reaction was to that kind of psychedelic opening.
Well, I think pretty much, I mean, of course, Leary and Ramdas, I mean, they're both the kind of people that they have such a different worldview anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, and I just recently read the book Being Ramdas, which I really
Hmm.
thoroughly enjoyed. And I'm always trying to put a few more pieces of the whole puzzle that I know together. And but I didn't only when I read that book did I find out that Ramdas was the first person that got to Harvard because David
Oh,
McClellan, who was their department chair, Ramdas had um, worked with him or done some things with him as like an undergraduate or at some other point in his life. So David um, knew Ramdas and he recruited him for Harvard. And then they hired Tim. And so Tim came second. And so Tim hadn't been there very long before Ralph came.
oh,
And um, and then they were in a class together, which with I know of several people. I don't know when you were at CAS, were you with, did you know uh Michael Kahn?
oh no.
So Michael Kahn was a psychology professor and he ran one of the counseling centers for a while. And he was, I believe he was a year older. So I don't think he was in Ralph's class, but I think he
Hmm.
was maybe a year older. But anyway, he was there at Harvard with Ralph. And then Delee Lance, she was a psychology professor at CIS for a while. Ralph brought her there, and
Oh,
she was in his Harvard class. She has an essay in the book. Uh, and so um, the way, I mean, just knowing those people, and then I know I've heard so many stories, and I know of others, who are there. It seems like they just kind of all opened up at the same time. I mean, there
hmm.
wasn't, or at least the people in their department or their small cohort of grad students. And I mean, first they kind of became subjects, and then they started running the experiments, and then they started writing about it. I mean, all these, it was just it, one thing after another. Um, happen. But um, and I've heard Ralph say too, I mean, it's just like his first psychedelic experience just really opened his mind, like incredibly opened his mind. And one thing that's really interesting to me that almost none of us would know, but I just have had the privilege of realizing this, um, is that Ralph died on March 14th. And as I've dug more into his life, I've found these dates that correspond with March 14th that were really important. I mean, turning points, including one that was his first psychedelic experience. It
Wow.
was either like on March 13th or 14th, but it was like one of those days. And so
Wow.
I always, it discovering that, it makes me wonder how many, how all of our lives, if there's a certain date that, that death date that we don't know,
Right.
but how that corresponds with our life as it, as it unfolds. So
Mhm.
anyway,
That's great. No, yeah, that's
interesting.
profound. And a good example, of course, the psychologist Carl Jung calls it synchronicity.
Right,
And it is amazing how much that is just the tapestry of our lives. And so often we'll find these synchronicities here and there. It's like, well, you don't realize it's happening all the time, and you're just not mapping it out necessarily.
right.
And especially with a death date, because we don't know it in advance. And no, that's incredible. Yeah, that's great. And just, I never get tired of thinking about that moment in history when these psychologists at Harvard were opening this up and taking what, of course, are traditional medicines for so many people, peyote, psilocybin, ayahuasca, etc., but opening it up to the Western mind, the modern mind, and how much that's changed our society, and continues to, and including more people applying psychedelics to psychotherapy, and it's gradually entering the mainstream, and that's always been such a hope for me personally, and just thinking of that, how important those people were in ushering that forward, and especially one of the things I appreciate about Ralph's work in particular is how he was, no matter how far out the stuff he was talking about, he was such a good scholar about it. And it's easy. I mean, God bless Ram Dass, but he's so spiritual about his stuff. I'm like, but we do need good scholars doing good scholarly work. And Ralph was so good at doing that kind of stuff. And I am so thankful for that because I think without that kind of scholarly work, we wouldn't have psychedelics entering the mainstream. It would still be seen as this kind of subculture, counterculture. And like, we need to integrate it into our culture. And that's exactly the kind of stuff that he did, while also still honoring the esoteric and the countercultural. So, that being said, we have to talk more specifically about the book. It's really an amazing book. And I'm still not through the whole thing because I've been savoring all the essays so much. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how this book came about and what's in it, who are the contributors, because there's a lot of good stuff. I have a short little essay that I'm really honored to be part of, but talking more about the eco-psychology side of his work. But yeah, there's a lot going on here because again, like we've been saying, there's so many different threads that he's pulled together in his life and his work.
Well, um, you know, I had the idea always, I thought, there really should be a festschrift for Ralph. I mean, a festschrift is something that usually another scholar puts together for a fellow scholar while they're alive. I learned that there's another term, Gedenkschrift, which is a German word for um, a similar thing that's done after somebody dies. So it's a little bit like that, but um, I never, anyway, the way it came about was that one of the people, Alan Levin, from who had spoken at his memorial, he sent me his, like, the written transcript of what he had said. And I thought, this is really good. I should publish this. And around the same time, a man in Germany, Friedrich Rerenbach, he wrote to me and said, what do you think about like a festschrift for Ralph? And these two things kind of came together at the same time. And I thought, well, okay. And Ralph has this newsletter, Green Earth Foundation, well, this foundation, Green Earth Foundation, and then um, that I've been a part of since we founded it in 1988, and um, anyway, I thought I'll just put it out there in the newsletter and ask if anybody's interested in writing an essay. And so when I did, then I had about 80 responses, pretty quick responses, like, yes, I want to do this. So then my editor and I, we just figured out, sort of the protocol and you know, how to do it, how to put up the call and get permissions and all that. And um, gave a timeline, and I actually got 87 essays. Now, probably 10 of those are people who I solicited, who I thought, wait a minute, who hasn't responded, who I think really should be in this book. Because not everybody's going to read or notice the something that's put out in a newsletter like that. So, and I think one great thing, or one thing that contributes to its richness, is that Ralph really included me in all of his relations. It's not like I know probably everybody in that book except for maybe I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10 maybe that I've never met, like yourself.
Right.
But for the most part, Ralph would always, introduce me to people that he thought were interesting, that were part of his life, and then I'm kind of a networker, connector, and I suppose I just grease the wheels. And but I have connections with all these people, so at least enough connection to solicit articles and do the back and forth, and they know me, and um, so um, so some of the essays are like that, um, like Dennis McKenna and Eduardo Luna are a couple that come to my mind. Uh, Charlie Grobe, and anyway, so I just started collecting the articles, and then I kind of, read through and did one edit. I tried to edit as much as I could, but then I had a professional editor working with me too, and I fundraised for the money that went to pay him. Um, um, so yeah, it was just like there was so much information and so rich, and it was so diverse. And maybe in some ways, it's almost like it had a life of its own, like putting it
Mhm.
out that way too. I mean, I got things that were just like I couldn't I couldn't have thought of that. I guess that's probably the book is rich because both it has my thought of who should be in this, but it also had this serendipitous uh energetic where people that I didn't know or wouldn't have thought of, like Chelis Glendenning. She's a writer who lives in Bolivia, and she and Ralph had this amazing pen pal relationship,
Huh.
and he would send her tea and she would send him coca candies from Brazil. I mean, from Bolivia. I never knew that until that book. So there's things like that are just and amazing. And then it's very well written. It's a very interesting essay about kind of about that and her relationship with him and etc. So um, so it was really a pleasure to work on him. It's really interesting. And unfortunately, so we had 87 contributions. We had to cut 27. I mean,
Hmm.
we cut and cut, and then we thought couldn't cut anymore. So finally, then the publishers just, I mean, I stretched their limit of pages, and then they boiled it down a little more. So some didn't get there. There's 27 essays I posted on the Green Earth Foundation website, so they're there, but not in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, the publisher's like, look, this can't be 1,000 pages. As much as we'd like to do that, that is too big. And even as it stands, it's a very thick volume. So yeah, no, I appreciate that, and appreciate the kind of the surprises that showed up along the way. Like, oh wait, he had this pen pal relationship with this person, and you never know what you're gonna get from people because again, it was such a thinking so broadly and so deeply in so many different fields. People get like, well, here's what I remember from him, or here's how he impacted my life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll tell you, for folks who are tuning into the podcast who don't know, I mean, you mentioned f folks like Luis Eduardo Luna, Charlie Grobe, Dennis McKenna. These are like amazing people in their fields. And so like it's not, I was a student of Ralph, but I mean these are people who are just amazing scholars and researchers, and it's incredible what his impact was, and to see those kind of people saying, "Well, here's what he meant to me," and so I mean, again, the subtitle of the book, "The Life and Legacy of a Psychedelic Pioneer." Of course, the pioneer metaphor has its problems, but it is true that this is somebody who really led the way, and so many people were impacted in such a beneficial way. And it really is a beautiful way to commemorate his life and work, and to showcase the way that that legacy is still very much alive. So I imagine that that was maybe a very healing and nourishing way to kind of grieve and to mourn, because of course grief and mourning are such a beautiful part of the mystery of life and death, but to make it also a celebration, and to find the joy in it, it's just such a beautiful work. And I
Yeah.
also have to say the cover is really great. Were you part of choosing the cover? How did
No,
how,
it wasn't. It
oh,
wasn't. And I will also say it wasn't also quite my title. Like I had
oh,
Ralph Metzner, I think I had it's like I had Explorer of Consciousness in the title, but I didn't have this word psychedelic in it. And
hmm,
then the publishers uh they came back with that. And I'm sure they wanted that for sales probably.
right.
But I was trying to think of, I was trying not to use that word because his life was about so much more than just psychedelics.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was fine. And I understood that. And
Yeah.
no, and the cover is interesting because in their first printing, they forgot to identify who's on the cover. And so it's supposed to be in the second printing, um, but on the cover is it's I learned that it's a photo that was taken at a psychedelic conference in 1977 here in the Bay Area. And on the cover it's Ram Dass and Allen Ginsberg and Albert Hoffman and then Ralph. Yeah. And then they
Yeah, pretty great. Yeah. I mean, Allen Ginsberg, of course, great poet in the Beat movement, and I mean, just legendary. And of course, we've talked about Ram Dass. And then Albert Hoffman, for people who don't know, is the person who, I guess you could say, discovered slash invented LSD. And so yeah, that picture with the three of them with Ralph, just epic. And yeah, and I appreciate, I mean, because again, like I came to CIS to study largely because Ralph was there. And for me, it was the ecological psychology thing. And of course, like psychedelics are important, and so much respect for his role in that whole movement. Um, but it was the way that that cashes out into an ecological rethinking of what psychology is all about. And like, that's why I'm here. So yeah, I appreciate the publishers like, "Hey, psychedelics will get the sales." That's kind of the hot topic. If you're just like, oh, a very broad thinker who's interested in all kinds of traditions and all schools of thought, you're like, no, say psychedelics. So yeah, I appreciate that. It is funny. I've published a few things, and working with publishers about titles, you can tell they're like, look, it's for the sales. We got to do it. And yeah, and hate to pigeonhole him like that because like such and the essays really testify to that. The essays in the volume indicate how much he was thinking with all these global traditions. And on that note, I also have to say, for folks listening to this, it was Ralph who introduced me to the work of Thomas Berry, and who's another thinker who was very interested in all of the world's spiritual traditions. And Thomas Berry is really central to what we do at the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. He was kind of foundational to the people who started the forum, Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm. And so, like, I wouldn't have a career without Thomas Berry. And like, well, who introduced you to Thomas Berry? It was Ralph. He was like, you got to read this stuff. And I was like, who's this guy? some, a Catholic priest. And I'm like, oh no. He's like, trust me, this is good stuff and it'll help bring spirituality back down to earth. So yeah. So yeah, can't say enough good things about it. And also have to say, I'm really inspired also that your relationship was so intertwined. Like you were saying, he introduced you to like all the people that were important in his life, and you're networking with him the whole time. That's so inspiring to me. My wife also is somebody who works in the same field as me. We both teach at the University of San Francisco. She's been on the podcast several times, and this kind of power couple is so inspiring to me because I think there's definitely people who keep their intellectual pursuits private, and the fact that you were able to share them like that is just such an inspiration to me personally, and I just really appreciate that. Can't say enough good things about that, and I think it's important for people to know that when you fall in love with somebody, it's not just the heart; it can also be the head, and you can share your full self with each other. And I think when intellectual pursuits have that kind of love in them, I think that's really what knowledge and wisdom is all about. Well, geez, I could keep picking your brain for a long time. I try to be mindful of the time. I know there's some podcasts out there like 2 and 3 hours long, and I'm like, that's too much.
Right.
Um, but this was just
Yeah.
great, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you more, especially since we're both in Sonoma. We got to hang out, and I know you're doing more
Right.
stuff promoting the book, and I know there's an event coming up in September, and looking forward to participating with you there. At what, the Alembic in Berkeley, the place that Eric Davis is kind of
Mhm.
running, and I
Yes.
need to get him on the
Yes.
podcast. He's certainly a friend of a friend. I don't know him personally very well, but love his work as well. So anyway, thank you so much, Kathy. This has just been a delight, and we have to do this again sometime. For now, here's how I like to end every episode. I like to ask whoever my guest is to have the last word, because after all, the title of the podcast is Spotlights, and so it's about putting the spotlight on you and your work. And so I like to end the podcast episode with a word, if you have one word, or a phrase. A phrase is welcome as well. It doesn't have to, sometimes it's kind of mean to put people on the spot and be like, give me one word. But if you have a word or a phrase that comes to mind, and we can use that to close us out.
Well, what comes to my mind is, you know, Ralph's main thing. I mean, if I had to say one word, it'd be awareness. Um, but he has this kind of formula that he put on yellow stickies, and he kind of put it all, he kind of lived by it, and he put it around the house, like on the
Hmm.
mirror, different places.
Hmm.
And my daughter made it, took that and some other things on stickies, made an art piece out of it. But anyway, it goes like attention plus intention equals awareness. So it's just about like, attending to things, having intentions, then attending, and then, expanding your awareness.